If you've been trying to navigate the Australian housing market lately, I bet you are feeling incredibly frustrated. You're probably scrolling through listings, looking at the numbers, and thinking literally none of this makes any sense. Well, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to solve the central contradiction of this crazy market. We're going to break it down simply, look at the actual numbers, and really understand what's going on beneath the surface. Because let's be real, you need to know this before making a decision that's going to affect the next 20 or 30 years of your life.
Right now, we're looking at a situation that completely breaks basic economics. Seriously, it defies logic. On one hand, fewer people are buying homes. Loan approvals are slowing way down. Buyers are just vanishing, and overall demand is measurably dropping. But on the flip side, house prices are still sitting near record highs, so fewer buyers, but higher prices. In a normal world, when demand falls, prices are supposed to drop right along with it. That's just basic supply and demand, right? Yet we are seeing the exact opposite.
Okay, let's dive into this. How is this even possible? If you're out there trying to buy a place right now, the whole system probably feels completely disconnected from reality. It just feels broken. But I promise you, it's not random. It is actually the result of a highly specific chain of events that's quietly making home ownership harder than ever. So to figure out why the old rules just don't apply anymore, we have to really look closely at the math.
And to do that, we need to step away from the flashy news headlines and dive straight into the hard numbers. We need to pinpoint exactly when affordability completely broke. And that means looking at the very real, practical difference between borrowing money today versus borrowing money just a few short years ago. Because the sticker price of a house, well, that's really only half the story. The cost of the money you borrow is the true dictator of what you can actually afford.
Let's put this into perspective. Back in 2021, the median home price in Australia was hovering around $550,000. Today, it's closer to $750,000. That is a massive jump, obviously. But the sticker price alone isn't actually what broke the market. It's the interest rates. In 2021, you could easily lock in a home loan for around 2%. Today, you're looking at something like 6 to 6.5%. So what does that mean in reality? Well, for a standard $700,000 loan, that old 2% rate meant a monthly payment of roughly $2,600. Today, at 6.5%, that exact same loan demands a monthly payment of about $4,400. It's this brutal compounding effect of the price jumping up and the rate jumping up at the same time that absolutely destroys affordability.
$1,800. Just let that sink in for a second. That is the staggering amount of extra cash you need every single month just to service a standard $700,000 loan today compared to 2021. Going from 2% to 6% might not sound like a huge leap when you just say the percentages out loud, but financially, in real hard dollar terms, it changes absolutely everything about a family's monthly budget.
And honestly, here's the most painful part of this whole math equation. That extra $1,800 a month, it doesn't buy you an extra bedroom. It doesn't get you a bigger backyard or a nicer neighborhood. It is for the exact same house, the same location, the same structure. You are paying significantly more for the property and significantly more for the loan at the exact same time, and you are getting absolutely nothing extra in return. So how on earth did the entire housing landscape shift so aggressively? Well, to understand this paradox, we need to play detective for a minute and trace the clues back a few years. We've got to go back and look at the massive demand explosion that kicked off in 2020. Let's quickly walk through how this all built up. When COVID hit in 2020, the government's #1 priority was keeping the economy from collapsing. So what did they do? They lowered interest rates straight to the floor. Money became incredibly cheap to borrow. Buyers suddenly realized, hey, I can afford a much bigger home for the exact same monthly cost, so they totally flooded the market. Then, moving into 2021, the whole work-from-home era fundamentally shifted what we needed from our living spaces. But as we all know, the consequences eventually caught up with us. By 2022, inflation peaked, everything got wildly expensive, and that forced the Reserve Bank to aggressively hike rates right back up to where we're sitting today. And this perfectly illustrates how working from home just completely rewired buyer behavior. Suddenly, your house wasn't just the place you slept, it was your office, it was your gym, it was the place you stared at the same four walls 24/7. People desperately wanted more space. So we saw this massive migration out of the crowded cities and into the suburbs and regional areas. This pushed an explosion of demand into areas where housing supply was already really limited, and naturally, prices just shot through the roof incredibly fast. But then came the second big shock,
inflation. When the cost of groceries and gas and pretty much everything else skyrocketed, the Reserve Bank had to step in and hike those interest rates up and fast. And just like that, borrowing money became wildly expensive again. People who could have easily snagged a home in 2021 suddenly couldn't even qualify for a basic loan. Demand just fell off a cliff. But this right here is what leads us to the grand reveal of our mystery, the Great Market Freeze.
Which brings us to the million-dollar question. So why didn't prices fall? Seriously, let's just pause and let that sink in for a moment. If demand dropped so drastically because loans became way too expensive, why on earth didn't housing prices come down? Literally every economics textbook out there tells you that when buyers leave the market, sellers have to lower their prices to attract whoever is left. So why isn't that happening here? So the crucial point here is understanding the mindset of a current homeowner. Let's walk through their internal monologue for a second. Step 1, they're sitting pretty on an ultra-low 2% interest rate that they locked in back in 2020 or 2021. Step 2, if they sell their house today to move somewhere else, they lose that incredibly cheap loan forever, and they have to take on a brand new 6.5% loan. Step 3, doing that means paying thousands of dollars more every single month, often for a very similar property. So step 4, they look at the math and realize it makes vastly more financial sense to just stay put, even if they really want to move, even if their family has grown or their job has changed. Financially speaking, leaving is just a terrible decision.
And because millions of homeowners would instantly lose those golden, cheap loans if they moved, the supply of available houses plummeted at the exact same time that demand dropped. It's crazy, but people are ironically trapped by their own good fortune. Their fantastic interest rates are essentially golden handcuffs. So we end up in this bizarre, highly frustrating standoff where you have significantly fewer buyers out there, but you also have significantly fewer sellers.
And that perfectly defines exactly what we are seeing today. It is not a housing crash, it is a market freeze. This happens when both buyers and sellers pull back simultaneously, and the actual volume of real estate transactions just grinds to a halt. Because there's so little supply actually hitting the market, the few buyers who are still out there looking end up fighting over scraps. And that competition is exactly what keeps prices artificially elevated despite the absolutely terrible borrowing conditions. The natural, flowing cycle of the real estate market has literally just stopped moving.
But, beyond all the charts and the economic gridlock, we're talking about real people here. People just trying to build their lives. And the ones who are suffering the absolute most in this frozen system, without a doubt, it's first-time buyers.
Now, what's really interesting and honestly kind of devastating is visualizing the gap we're dealing with. You have the steady, relatively modest growth of average incomes, and it is just being completely dwarfed by the absolute rocket ship of housing costs. Just imagine someone earning a decent income today, saving a portion of every paycheck, doing absolutely everything right. A few years ago, that person had a very clear, achievable path to buying a home. Today, that exact same person is entirely priced out. And it's not because they failed or made bad financial choices, it's simply because the cost of housing accelerated so incredibly fast that it completely detached from normal income growth. That widening gap is the real tragedy of this market freeze.
Now, I know there are probably a lot of you watching this explainer who are just crossing your fingers, hoping and waiting for a massive crash. You're waiting for the bubble to pop so you can finally buy in at a reasonable price. But we really need to be clear about something. This isn't 2008. Back then, the fundamental system was weak. People had terrible, risky loans they couldn't actually afford, which led to mass defaults and a huge flood of forced housing supply. Today is completely different. Homeowners can largely afford the homes they are in right now because they are locked into those stable, older, low rates. The fundamental system here just isn't crumbling under bad debt in the same way it did back then.
So the system isn't weak, it's just frozen, which really begs the question, where does that leave you? That's the big thing you have to ask yourself right now. If you're sitting on the sidelines waiting for some dramatic 40% price drop that might literally never come because sellers just refuse to give up their cheap loans, well, you might be waiting forever. I really challenge you to reconsider your strategy in a market that just flat out refuses to play by the old rules. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep analyzing the numbers, stay informed, and I'll see you next time as we continue to unpack the complex world around us.